This is a review of The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, Chronicles, Art and Design. And this is the fifth book in the Hobbit Chronicles and the final art book. And this is the first review you've seen in this series. I strongly recommend going back and watching the first one because that gives a much better overview and a sort of a proper review of the series, because I don't want to be repeating information for people who have watched all the videos in the series. And like all the other Hobbit Chronicles, this one is just as good. Although I will try and identify a couple of things that make it a bit different, just for the sake of distinguishing it. First of all is the sheer number of images in this book. I mentioned that the other two art books in this series have around 1,000 images each, which is already completely sort of unprecedented. I mean, except for a couple of big video game art books. I'm not really familiar with many live action movie art books or even animated movie art books that have quite that many images. So they had 1,000. This one has 1,800 images. Now, I'm not saying I doubt that claim. I haven't actually been through and counted. That number is just based on what it says on the back of the book, and I'm willing to trust that that's true, but I do have like that sort of slight doubt just because it's so hard to comprehend. And the length and size of the book is exactly the same as the others, which may lead you to suspect that if they're cramming that many images into a book this size, they're probably going to be pretty small. And the answer to that is kind of. Every few pages you will be getting several images that are far too small and that you will wish were a little bigger so you could make out more detail. But despite that, it really wasn't as egregious as I thought it would be. And I certainly wouldn't take a star off or anything for this book. It's still absolutely a 5-star book. And I'm kind of just grateful for the sheer quantity of stuff this book offers. So despite the fact that this is a fantasy art book with the title The Battle of the Five Armies, it may not be the Warhammery, action-packed visuals you're expecting. Of course, there are quite a number of really amazing fantasy battle sequences depicted, but really that's only in the last quarter of the book. The majority of the book is sort of focused on other things like costumes and location design. My absolute favorite part of this book is just a 2-page spread that shows concept art for a deleted scene. And in fact, it's a scene that isn't even in the extended edition, nor in the extended edition appendices. And that's one of the things I really get a kick out of in art books, is when they are not just reflecting exactly what you see on screen, but also showing other concepts and ideas that were explored by the filmmakers and either changed or abandoned. And so in the book, there's just like a 2-page spread with maybe 4 images that makes reference to a scene that would have taken place when Gandalf was in Dol Guldur, when he would have found a Palantir, which, if you don't remember from Lord of the Rings, is one of those seeing stones that you can use that Saruman uses to communicate with Sauron, and I guess also can be used for perhaps seeing visions of the future or something like that, because Gandalf would have found it and seen a sort of this apocalyptic end-of-the-world vision of the future, of Smaug leading an army of orcs. And I'm really surprised that never ended up in the movie, because not only is it visually and sound really cool, I think it's actually really helpful from a storytelling perspective to really explain more specifically Sauron's interest in Erebor, to get his hands on Smaug, who is essentially a weapon of mass destruction, rather than what they ended up using in the movie, which was just having Gandalf give vague references to Sauron's interests. So despite the fact that these books are incredibly thorough, there is one thing that is sort of missing from this series, and I understand why it wasn't included, but that is any sort of art or really reference to Guillermo del Toro's version of The Hobbit. If you've watched the appendices that come with the extended edition, and if you haven't, then you 100% should. I know a lot of people nowadays aren't really into buying physical media, but even if you never watch the Hobbit movies again, I still think it's worth the investment just to get your hands on those behind-the-scenes appendices. But anyway, Guillermo del Toro was originally set to direct the movies, and he actually spent 18 months with the art department, producing and doing pre-production for 2 Hobbit movies, but because there was a lot of stuffing around getting the movies greenlit, he eventually had to leave, and then Peter Jackson came on to direct. And because he didn't really want to do Peter Jackson's interpretation of Guillermo del Toro's interpretation of The Hobbit, they scrapped everything that had been developed over that 18-month pre-production period and just started from scratch. And so there must have been a ton of art created for this version of The Hobbit we'll never get to see, and I do completely understand why that stuff wasn't included in these books, because it's sort of not really connected to the development of the movie that we're seeing on screen. But it is sort of just more wishful thinking on my behalf that I do wish there was some way we could see some of that stuff, because a year and a half of pre-production is a lot of time for people to spend working on something that now there is essentially no record of, which seems a real shame to me. And I just think it would be so interesting to see this sort of other interpretation of The Hobbit that was most likely very different to the one we received. So I'm not sure if this has been a very good review, because I've sort of picked apart inconsequential things and talked about a lot of kind of unrelated stuff, and so I definitely don't want to leave you with the impression that this book is in any way lackluster, because it really is amazing, and just like all the books in this series, some of the best art and making of books you will ever have the pleasure of reading.